TOEFL listening section, you will see that there will be 4 to 6 lectures with classroom discussion and 2 to 3 conversations between 2 people. The length of passage and the number of questions generally depends on how many passages you're given. So for example, some passages may last 3 minutes, others may last 5, and you approximately have 6 questions each. And again, depending on how many questions you're asked, the timing lasts from 60 to 90 minutes. Now, just like we discussed in the reading series, there are specific question types that the TOEFL will be asking. So in this series, we'll be examining in a little more general way the 8 question types we see on the test. Those 8 question types are questions involving basic comprehension. For example, questions about the gist. Gist is another word for just basic idea. The 2 gist questions you may see involve the content of the actual listening passage and the purpose. You may even have detail questions about specific details mentioned in the passage. Questions referred to as pragmatic understanding questions. Sometimes these are called replay questions because they will play part of the conversation again. The 2 pragmatic questions that the TOEFL asks involve the function of what is said and questions involving the speaker's attitude, which we will refer to in this series as the stance. The other question we will see falls under the connecting information question. Questions involving understanding organization, connecting content, and then finally making an inference. So, what are some of the basic features of the conversations that we will see on the TOEFL? Well, first off, the key is to recognize that in this part of the test, the conversations will involve a student and some person of authority, often a professor at a university. The topics usually involve some problem or issue the student's having around campus or in class. For example, maybe the student is going to miss class. Maybe the student already missed a paper deadline. Maybe the student didn't understand a class lecture, or needs help finding a book, or has to pay a fine, something in which they have to interact with an authority figure on campus. What usually happens here on the TOEFL is that the conversation ends with the person of authority reminding the student of university or class policies, helping the student come up with some sort of solution to the problem. And in the conversation, another thing that's often very clear is to understand the power relationship between the two. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, again, you'll probably notice that, just like you see in this picture, the authority is the person who has all the power. The student, on the other hand, is the one seeking some help, permission, or so on. Now, this, of course, seems fairly obvious if we're talking about an interaction between a student and authority. But you will see in this following example here, how this actually works on the test. So again, we refer to this as stance. The stance is kind of the position that the person is taking in the conversation. So as you can imagine, the authority figure's stance will probably be seem more confident and firm, and even sometimes perhaps annoyed at the student. The student's stance, on the other hand, is usually a little unsure, uncertain, or even intimidated. Now, of course, this is not always true, but you will find that with many of the conversations, this is usually how it works. Now, solving the conversations, generally the questions you'll see kind of revolve around these particular areas of the conversation. So thinking about what's the student's problem or issue, and of course this is involving the details of that problem. What is the authority figure's stance? Now, of course, this is referring to the particular attitude of the speaker. So in this case, was the speaker helpful, upset, irritated? And then usually involving something to the solution of the situation. And again, this is including perhaps details of what that solution might be. Now, in this video series, our goal is to try to help us prepare for the test. So we're going to try to use some test-like ideas, But for example, in this video, we will actually listen to the conversation twice. This, of course, is not permitted on the test, but the goal is to help us improve our understanding and how to respond. So the first time you listen, this is a little technique that we can kind of think about. First off, note-taking is permitted on the TOEFL. So for this section of the test, write down the following categories, leaving some space in between each one. So find a piece of paper and then write down these three categories. Student's problem or situation, professor's general stance, in this case authority figure is fine too, and resolution to the problem. Now this is an example here that I will show you, so that way you can give yourself a little space in between, and of course you can put more lines in between each one, because obviously you want to try to take as many notes as possible. So first off, this is kind of the first trick that students often encounter, mainly because many students who are taking the TOEFL may not have a lot of experience taking notes in English. So oftentimes they have difficulty in determining which words are important and which ones are not. So we're going to examine the difference between taking notes versus taking dictation. Taking notes is not the same thing. So the first thing we need to realize is that taking notes usually involves trying to copy down every word that's being said, using the same words in the exact same order. And that's impossible to do on this test, mainly because there's just way too much information, and of course you hear the information only once. So the first problem students have is they often get so focused on copying down or writing down everything they hear, they often are not paying attention to the rest of the conversation. So how do we take notes? Well, again, it's important to try to get all the information, or at least important information, but part of it is also thinking about which details and ideas are important and which ones are kind of minor. So the key really is to understand how information is given. How is it given, especially in a spoken way? Well, we're going to take a moment and look at common spoken conventions and cohesive devices that we use specifically in listening contexts. So starting with cohesive devices, you might recall that in the reading series we talked about the concept of cohesion. Cohesion usually is involving showing how information fits together. And the various devices we discussed in the previous series was talking about how information is often restated, how we might see synonyms or synonymous language, reference words or ideas, showing us kind of the direction of where information might be found. And of course, signal words are very important. And I would recommend that if you need to review the idea of cohesion, it would be a good idea to go back to the TOEFL reading series and kind of look at that a little more carefully. However, there will be some differences in how these are used in the different contexts. Obviously, with reading, we can see the information all the time. So we can understand that we will probably have the opportunity to use a lot of rephrased and restated information, and probably it's going to be a little more formal. And of course, we'll have not as much direct repetition of ideas. But in a speaking context, it may be different. We also notice that the signal words we could see in a reading could be more expansive, because obviously we have a lot of text to connect and a lot of ideas to give. So perhaps it might be more difficult to understand some of those signals, so they may be more expansively used in reading. And then, of course, we would use more specific written conventions, and, of course, thinking about academic organization. So, for example, obviously we have the idea of using punctuation to help show how information sticks together, too. But in listening and speaking, you might notice that there may be more direct repetition of words and less use of rephrased or restated ideas. Or at least ideas will be perhaps repeated more often because it's a listening context. And we try to emphasize information because we can't see the information being written down. We also might see frequent use of signal words, but perhaps not as expansive as you would see in a reading context. And they might be even simpler in meaning. And finally, we would have those spoken conventions. So things that we would use in writing, obviously like punctuation, we can't really see in spoken contexts. So notice that, for example, changing the pitch of our voice can often give us certain clues or signals, and these are things we can't see in a reading context either. Now, when we talk about spoken conventions, here's kind of a list of some ideas that might be helpful to think about. First off, obviously, since things are being spoken, You might notice that we might have certain listening cues to show the person's kind of paying attention. So, for example, people might say something like right or uh-huh. We also might see things that people might use in a short way to show that they agree or acknowledge information or even demonstrate that they're comprehending what's being said. So again, someone might say something like, well, of course, or uh-huh. So again, kind of similar to the listening cue as well. We may even have signs of disagreement or confusion. So again, notice how the pitch might play a part here. Well, These are the types of things we would not see in a reading context, especially, of course, since you might see it in a conversation. Again, since we do have a professor or an authority figure involved, oftentimes we might get language that reminds people of something. So the professor might say something like, don't forget about this, or I should mention something like this. Of course, we talked about the fact that we have changes in pitch. So, for example, we might have pitch that rises. That's often something we hear with questions. Or falling pitch often is used at the end of sentences. Of course, we use some of these in different ways as well. Finally, the use of questions. Obviously, questions are very common in academic lectures. We might see, of course, direct questions, questions that people ask each other, and that's very important, of course, on the TOEFL. And then we might even see what are called rhetorical questions. Now, we'll see these more when we talk about lectures, but rhetorical questions are basically questions the professor asks, but doesn't really expect an answer. It's just a question to help kind of connect information, one idea to the next. Now, the TOEFL has been very generous, or ETS rather, has been very generous in providing the transcript of the listening example. But I think in order for us to get the true experience, we're not actually going to use the transcript right now. We will actually analyze it a little bit later in the video to kind of better illustrate some of the points we're talking about. So please, for now, don't look at the transcript. So I really want you to have the experience of sort of taking the listening test, or at least some of the experience. So for this time, please don't look at the transcript because, of course, this is not possible on the TOEFL. Now, let's get ready to listen to the conversation for the first time. Now, you will notice that they will give us a picture. The picture obviously provides some help. In the conversations, though, probably not as much. But you'll be able to see the fact that we are in what the particular context we are in. So first off, you'll notice that this appears to be some kind of library. So the first conversation, the conversation that you will hear in this video involves a librarian and a student. So now, listen, and make sure to take notes.
Hi, I'm new here. I couldn't come to the student orientation, and I'm wondering if you could give me a few quick pointers about the library. I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Now, what's your major area of study?
Latin American literature.
Okay, well, over here is the section where we have language, literature, and the arts. And if you go downstairs, you'll find the history section. Generally, the students who concentrate in Latin American literature find themselves researching in the history section a lot.
You're right. I am a transfer student. I've already done a year at another university, so I know how the research can go. I spent a lot of time in the history section. So how long can I borrow books for?
Our loan period is a month. Oh, I should also mention that we have an interlibrary loan service if you need to get hold of a book that's not in our library. There's a truck that runs between our library and a few other public and university libraries in this area. It comes around 3 times a week.
Hey, that's great. At my last school, it could take a really long time to get the materials I needed. So when I had a project, I had to make a plan way in advance. This sounds much faster. Another thing I was wondering is there a place where I can bring my computer and hook it up?
Sure. There's a whole area here on the main floor where you can bring a laptop and plug it in for power. But on top of that, we also have a connection for the internet at every seat.
Nice. So I can do all the research I need to do right here in the library. I'll have all the resources, all the books, and information I need right here in one place.
Yep, that's the idea. I'm sure you'll need photocopies too. They're down the hallway to your left. We have a system where you have to use a copy card, so you'll need to buy a card from the front desk. You insert it into the machine and you're ready to make copies.
How much do you guys charge?
7 cents a copy.
That's not too bad. Thanks. Where's the collection of rare books?
Rare books are up on the 2nd floor. They're in a separate room where the temperature is controlled to preserve the old paper in them. You need to get special permission to access them, and then you'll have to wear gloves to handle them because the oils in our hands, can destroy the paper, and gloves prevent that. So we have a basket of gloves in the room.
Okay, thanks. I suppose that's all I need to know. You've been very helpful. Thanks.
Anytime. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so what I have here is just sort of the kind of a basic outline, kind of an example here, using the three different categories we talked about earlier in the video. So first off, what's the problem or situation? Well, the student wants to know how to use some of the new library services and which library services are available. For example, how to borrow books, hooking up a computer, where the rare books are located, and mostly because he didn't have the chance to attend orientation. He was a transfer student. Now, what's interesting about this particular conversation is that the authority's stance throughout is actually very helpful and friendly. You will notice, of course, from the tone of her voice and, of course, the particular language that she uses, that it becomes pretty obvious very quickly that she's going to be helpful in this particular exchange. And the resolution basically is the fact that she's answering the student's questions and does actually suggest other resources. For example, you might want to use the copier, she said. And she also talked about how long you can loan books for. So in this case, we have a situation where the authority figure is actually helpful throughout and doesn't remind the student of any particular policies or doesn't seem particularly annoyed. So that's very helpful to know. Now, we're going to listen one more time, and the goal here now is to try to add more details to the information you already have. So, of course, this is not possible on the TOEFL, but since this is a video to help us prepare for it, I think it's probably a good idea for us to allow us to listen to it one more time so that we can catch more information. And try not to focus on the things you already know. Try to write down things you didn't catch the first time.
Hi, I'm new here. I couldn't come to the student orientation, and I'm wondering if you could give me a few quick pointers about the library. I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Now, what's your major area of study?
Latin American literature.
Okay, well, over here is the section where we have language, literature, and the arts. And if you go downstairs, you'll find the history section. Generally, the students who concentrate in Latin American literature find themselves researching in the history section a lot.
You're right. I am a transfer student. I've already done a year at another university, so I know how the research can go. I spent a lot of time in the history section. So how long can I borrow books for?
Our loan period is a month. Oh, I should also mention that we have an interlibrary loan service if you need to get hold of a book that's not in our library. There's a truck that runs between our library and a few other public and university libraries in this area. It comes around 3 times a week.
Hey, that's great. At my last school, it could take a really long time to get the materials I needed. So when I had a project, I had to make a plan way in advance. This sounds much faster. Another thing I was wondering is there a place where I can bring my computer and hook it up?
Sure. There's a whole area here on the main floor where you can bring a laptop and plug it in for power. But on top of that, we also have a connection for the internet at every seat.
Nice. So I can do all the research I need to do right here in the library. I'll have all the resources, all the books, and information I need right here in one place.
Yep, that's the idea. I'm sure you'll need photocopies too. They're down the hallway to your left. We have a system where you have to use a copy card, so you'll need to buy a card from the front desk. You insert it into the machine and you're ready to make copies.
How much do you guys charge?
7 cents a copy.
That's not too bad. Thanks. Where's the collection of rare books?
Rare books are up on the 2nd floor. They're in a separate room where the temperature is controlled to preserve the old paper in them. You need to get special permission to access them, and then you'll have to wear gloves to handle them, because the oils in our hands, can destroy the paper, and gloves prevent that. So we have a basket of gloves in the room.
Okay, thanks. I suppose that's all I need to know. You've been very helpful. Thanks.
Anytime. Bye.
Bye.
Now, before we start looking at the questions, we do need to go back and review the test strategy we talked about in the reading series, which is the process of elimination, also referred to as POE. Now, process of elimination is part of our overall general test strategy, the one that we use with multiple choice tests. Now, POE improves your chance at guessing when you're not sure of the correct answer, but we have to remember that no guessing strategy is 100%. If you don't understand the other answer choices, then you need to realize your chances at eliminating wrong answers will probably go down. So this is something important to remind students that since we do get the chance to use multiple choice answers here, we should still use the same process of elimination strategy we talked about before. But again, we're not going to spend time in this video reviewing all of the aspects of POA. So if it's something you've forgotten or need to go back and watch, or if this is your first time, you need to go back and look at the TOEFL Reading Skills video 2, which is talking about general test strategy. And you can find the link at the bottom of the screen. So now let's look at the questions they're going to ask us. Now once again, we need to remind you of the 8 question types. So as we go through, we're going to kind of quickly analyze what are the particular categories they're asking us. And again, you'll notice from the since it's a conversation, we won't necessarily see as many involving questions for connecting information. This is probably a little more common in the lecture situation, which we'll see next time. So a lot of the questions we will see will come from the 2 categories on the left. So now let's look at the questions. Now first we're going to analyze them and then see if we can figure out how to answer them. So first off, notice the question, why does the student come to the library? Well, the first key word here we see is why. It's describing or asking about the particular purpose of the student. So in this case, we would refer to this as a just purpose question. Now, let's look at the choices and see which ones we can eliminate and which ones we want to keep. First off, you will notice the answer choices. We're looking at something a little more general here. So, for example, if you think about, we'll skip A for a moment, just look at B. Notice it says to ask about interlibrary loans. Now, this is true, of course, that this was one of the things the student talked about, but it's not kind of the general reason. So in this case, we could probably easily eliminate B right now, because in this case, the question is not asking for a specific detail. Now, let's come back to A, to learn about the library's resources. Now, this seems fairly general enough to include all of the things the student talked about. So at this point, we'll go ahead and keep this one for a moment. Okay, let's look at C. C says to attend the new student orientation. Well, as we learned earlier, the student actually forgot or didn't have the chance to attend the orientation. So in this case, even though this seems possible, it's not actually something they discuss as the overall reason of why the student came. So at this point, we can go ahead and eliminate this one. Now, D looks pretty good because obviously the student does need to work on research and actually mentions the word research a few times. So let's keep this one just for a moment. Now look at the 2 choices we have left. Well, as we said before, if we could document all of the different things the student was looking for, the answer is probably most likely A, because it does seem to include, with its general use of the word resources, all of the different things that the student was asking about. D, of course, might be possible, but he actually didn't spend a lot of time asking about the research projects or the research facilities. There were other things that he asked about too. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Why does the librarian point out the history section? Well, again, this particular question does ask about the idea of why. Why does the librarian do this? So again, this is probably referring to a particular just purpose question as well. It also might be considered a detail question because we're listening for a specific detail as well. But let's think about how we can answer this one. So why? Well, let's look at our choices. Does she want to point out the closest area containing copy machines? Well, she does mention copy machines. The question is, does she necessarily mention them in connection to the history section? So part of the idea is we're thinking about how to connect this information. So in this case, we'll probably eliminate this one. In B, it asks about, she assumes that he will need to do research there. Well, if you recall from the conversation, he did mention that oftentimes he has to do research with Latin American studies. So this is a possibility. The student is looking for a book he used at his last school. Well, again, this is very possible, but why would a student be looking for a book from his last school here? Is it looking for a specific book? Did we actually hear the student mention this by name? Again, probably not. But at this point, since he was looking for a book, let's keep it just for a moment. And then finally, students sometimes mistakenly assume that the section contains literature books. Now, this one seems like a fairly good trick, because the idea here is it does seem very possible that students would assume this. But notice there's nothing in the actual text that talks about the fact that the student was mistaken, because he's new to the library. And in this case, there was no sort of discussion about how he was wrong looking for literature in the wrong section. So this case here will eliminate. So now we have two choices left. Which one seems to be probably relating to what the librarian is doing? Well, in this case, probably B is our best answer. Again, part of the idea is thinking about the focus of the question. It's talking about why the librarian is doing this. So in this case, B seems to be the one that most directly connects to what the librarian is doing. I mean, again, it is her purpose, and she's also been very helpful in the video. So again, notice how even the librarian's attitude or stance can play a part in some of the other questions. Okay, let's move on to the next question. What does the student imply about the interlibrary loan at his last school? Now, first off, the key word here is imply. To imply something means to kind of suggest something. So basically, we have to infer what the student is trying to say here. What does the student really mean? So we would refer to this as kind of an inference question. Now, let's see if we can remember. What exactly did the student say about the interlibrary loan service? Well, this brings us to our next trick. Since we talked about inferences in our previous video series, it's probably pretty helpful to go back and review this for a moment, because we found out on the last time that making an inference is very similar to just finding words that have the same basic idea. So really what we're looking for here is an answer choice that says basically the same thing, but in a different way. Now, many of the tricks we used in the reading section will be used here. So let's kind of review those. Watch out for answer choices that might use the exact same words. Oftentimes they may use the same words, but use them in the wrong way. Some of the answer choices may have correct information, but not necessarily all of it will be correct. Or we have answer choices that might have information in the wrong order. Now, of course, there are other listening tricks involved here too, and we will see these throughout the video series, but especially in the conversation section. So let's think for a moment, what could be some other listening related tricks? Well, for example, students have a difficult time remembering who said what or catching information because obviously it's very quick. So first off, we have to be aware of answer choices that might have words that kind of sound similar. Sometimes this is included on the test, though not very often. Of course, it's often difficult to remember the sequence of things, because obviously when they're speaking, it's difficult to write everything down without missing something. So we have to be careful of answer choices that confuse the sequence of events, or perhaps put information in the wrong order. The other problem is answer choices that make the wrong conclusions. Again, it's difficult to remember what the person was basically trying to say if we're writing things down at the same time. So again, we have to be careful that sometimes answer choices may have conclusions that aren't necessarily supported by what's in the listening passage. So notice here, we're going to look at this answer choice specifically and see if we can find any tricks. So think if you can remember if any of these ideas were mentioned in the conversation. So for example, did we hear the fact that there was something he never used at his previous library? Did we hear anything similar to that? Look at the next one. Did we actually talk about the idea that he appreciated? Now notice this phrasing of the question, he came to appreciate it, which basically means he didn't like it at first, but then liked it later. Here's the next one, it was inconvenient. Well, he did mention the fact that the interlibrary loan service took some time to plan for. So, for example, it may have taken him a while in order to use the service. So this one, of course, was definitely talked about as well. It was expensive. Well, money was talked about in the video itself. The question is, was it talked about in relation to the interlibrary loan service? So again, notice how each one may have maybe playing on some particular aspect of the listening, or some of them may just confuse some of the information because obviously it's easy to forget or it's easy to have missed something in the conversation. So let's kind of go back now and more specifically determine which ones to keep and which ones to eliminate. First off, he never used it. Well, he did spend some time talking about trying to use the service, so we know that this one is actually factually wrong. He came to appreciate it. Well, that's very possible that he actually liked the service, but it did sound like he was negative at some point. Well, let's keep it for now because this kind of implies that he was negative at one point and then liked it later. So that could be a possibility. Now, we already mentioned that he was negative about it in some ways because you had a plan for it. So in this case, let's keep this one as well. Now, as we said before, one of the tricks here is that money was discussed at some point in the conversation, but was it in connection to the library loan service? Well, in this case, the answer is no. So again, this one is particularly confusing because money was mentioned somewhere. So which of the last two choices seems to be the best? Well, since the student was talking mostly about how he liked what the current library service was offering, it seems most likely that since he didn't like his previous one, C would be the best answer choice here. That obviously he had to plan ahead, which took a lot of time. And again, we think of that as inconvenient. So in this case, this is the only answer choice that draws the right conclusion from the inference. Okay, and this one, it asks about what does a student need to do before he can use any rare books. Well, this is, if you'll notice right away, we have to choose two answers. That's a pretty clear sign that this is considered a detail question because we definitely have to use details from the listening in order to figure out what the answer is. So as you look at the answer choices, think about which ones we have to eliminate. So let's go through the choices. Does the student have to purchase a card, obtain permission, put on gloves, or try the interlibrary loan first? Well, first off, let's see which ones we think we can eliminate. Now, again, money and purchasing was mentioned at some point, but was it talking about purchasing a card in relation to the rare books? This was pretty much towards the end of the conversation. So in this case, we're going to eliminate A. Does the person have to get permission? Well, permission was mentioned, and since these are rare books, that seems to make sense. Let's keep this one for now. Put on gloves. Well, again, these are rare books, and oftentimes rare books are kept in places that we need some special protection. So in the conversation, they mentioned that probably wearing gloves is something you have to do. Finally, trying an interlibrary loan first. Well, yes, interlibrary loans were mentioned in the conversation, but was it actually mentioned in connection to the rare books? In this case, the answer is no. So now, I think we've found our two answer choices, to get permission and to put on gloves. But again, notice the tricks. The idea of a library card was mentioned somewhere, and the interlibrary loan was mentioned somewhere as well. So the question is, could you remember this in connection to the right information? Okay, our last question. Part of the conversation will be repeated. Listen again and answer the question. Now, immediately we should see that since it asks that the question will be repeated, this is what we refer to as the replay or the pragmatic understanding question. And specifically in this context, it will be discussing the function of what was said. Now, I will go ahead and play part of that conversation, and I want you to listen and then see what exactly are we looking for.
I'll have all the resources, all the books, and information I need right here in one place.
Yep, that's the idea.
Okay, so what does it mean when the librarian said, "Yep, that's the idea"? So notice it is always referring to the last line that the librarian uses. Well, again, part of the idea is to understand what pragmatics is really asking for. So at this point, let's take a moment and examine what pragmatic understanding means, because this is something you will see with every listening question, every listening passage on the test. First off, pragmatic understanding is basically thinking about another way to ask what someone really intends to say. Now, for example, if someone says, "It sure is hot in here," there could be numerous ways to interpret the intention. It really comes down to thinking about the following questions. First off, who is the person that's saying this? What is the situation they're in? And more specifically, what does the person want me or someone else in the conversation to do? Is there some action that the person is looking for? So, for example, let's take that phrase, "It sure is hot in here." Here are a couple of different contexts or situation. Let's see if you can kind of guess the possible intention. For example, if there are two students in a classroom, and one person says this to another, what could be the possible intention of that? Or what if you're saying this to a friend and you're both sitting in a hot room? Well, in the first example, perhaps you just want to complain. Obviously, you can't really do anything about the situation, so perhaps in this case, the intention is just to start a conversation. But in the second example, maybe your friend, for example, maybe this is in your friend's house, it could be basically telling the person in an indirect way, "Please open the window," or "Turn on the air conditioner." So we have to recognize that depending on the situation and depending on the people involved, we may have different conclusions or results depending on the situation. So on the test, you will see that basically the pragmatic understanding question really involves the authority figure. It'll almost never be about the student. And so in a way, this is kind of related to the person's stance. So we have to think, in this case, if the stance was pretty tough or irritated, then the question will probably somehow relate to that attitude. But in our example, the authority figure is very helpful. So that might help us in determining the answer to the question, maybe not, but let's see if it does. So as we look at the answer choices again, we're going to hear the replay, and then we're going to try to decide which we can eliminate first.
I'll have all the resources, all the books, and information I need right here in one place.
Yep, that's the idea.
So what does it mean when the librarian said, "Yep, that's the idea"? Okay, so now we've heard the replay. Which ones can we think about? Well, we kind of can notice right away that B seems to use a negative idea. And in this case, since the person's stance was fairly helpful, we probably can go ahead and eliminate B right now. Now jump back to A. It says, "I wish this were true." Well, obviously this sounds somewhat positive, but then the more you think about it, it sounds like the librarian is saying that it's not true now, but it's something we wished we could make true in the future. That doesn't seem very much a very helpful attitude in any way. So in this case, we can eliminate A as well. So now we have our two choices left. Certainly the language of the choice seems fairly positive. Thank you for your suggestion. So we'll keep this one. And that is what we intended. In other words, that was the purpose for why we do this. Which again would be very common for an authority figure. Remember, this is an authority figure, and oftentimes, even if the person is helpful, they still want to remind students of policies or things that they use around the university. So I think we're going to keep this one as well. So the question is, which one is the better answer? Well, in this case, the answer is D. When we say that's the idea meaning that's the reason for why we did this. So in this case, we actually have to kind of think about, in the situation, which one makes the most sense in the context. Well, in this case, the librarian was not asking for suggestions or even wanting suggestions. Remember, this person is the authority, which means in this case, she's not asking so many questions as much as the student is. So in this case, D makes the most sense. Now, obviously, we can't just look at the transcript anytime during the test. Of course, just like we can't listen to the conversation more than once. But again, the purpose of this video is to think about what we can learn from the experience. So now, if you have the TOEFL Quick Prep download in front of you, go ahead and look at the first listening activity and kind of follow along as we examine the transcript for some helpful clues and ideas. Now, part of our goal here is not just to point out every detail. You can do that as you skim through the information. But what I would like to point out are the different spoken conventions that are used. First off, if you notice right away, the student indicates that he's new and uses kind of a sort of utterance like, Well, in this case, this kind of shows that the student's kind of unsure or uncertain. Now, notice the student is congratulating or thanking the librarian for the help that's going to come. I'd really appreciate it. So notice the student is polite, which usually you'll find this on the TOEFL. Now, notice the librarian immediately establishes her stance as well. Sure, I'd be glad to. So notice right away her stance is going to be very helpful. And the TOEFL usually will give you this information probably within the first 2 lines. Now, as we kind of progress through the conversation, notice the different listening cues or acknowledgement cues the librarian uses. So, for example, okay, and then gives particular piece of advice. And then notice how the student confirms, again, that he is paying attention. And then the student actually confirms or agrees with what the librarian is saying. You're right. Now, also notice how questions help move the conversation along. The student asks these questions because that's generally what we expect students to do. Now, the librarian does ask one question because she needs some information. What's your major area of study? So notice again how questions help to connect information, how they provide more of a cohesive idea than you would see in a reading context. So as we're looking at these spoken inventions, we're trying to interpret what they mean. Okay, look at the next ones then. So what does she mean when she says, I should also mention? Well, again, that's a kind of remembering language or reminding language, or basically to add information. So it's kind of like saying in addition. So notice again, this spoken convention is a little bit different from what you might see in a reading context. Notice the student really likes the fact that the interlibrary loan situation is very good. Librarian confirms, again, using another convention, sure. Notice this particular idiomatic expression on top of that. So what she means, of course, is in addition. So again, these are things we see a lot more in conversation than we would see in reading. The student likes the idea again. So again, the TOEFL is taking great care here to show you what the particular stance is and how people feel about the situation throughout the conversation. And notice here, he kind of restates a lot of the information, the resources, the books, all the things I need right here in one place. So again, notice the student is kind of, again, summarizing a little bit as to what's going on. This is pretty common in conversation as people are kind of showing how they feel about the situation. Now, there's the replay question. And then notice she says, I'm sure you'll need photocopiers too. Well, again, this is the librarian. The librarian does have a certain set of script or a certain set of ideas that they always want to share with students because basically the librarian wants the students to use the library in the correct way. Now, notice the informal tone a little bit here. It's kind of interesting that the student says, how much do you guys charge? But again, this is pretty common in conversation, and the librarian is not exactly like a professor. Even though we want to be somewhat formal, the student probably is going to interact with the librarian in a slightly less formal way than with the professor, perhaps. And then notice again the student responding to certain situations. For example, that's not too bad. And then finally, notice how the student draws the conversation to a conclusion. Thanks. That's all I need to know right now. And then, of course, thanks the professor, which is a thanks the librarian, which may or may not be possible throughout all of the conversations. But since the librarian's helpful, and since the student needed help, this seems fairly logical as well. And then finally, notice the informal sort of goodbyes. Again, this is something you would probably not see with the professor. But since the librarian has to deal with a lot of students every day, probably a little bit of informality would be okay. So our final thoughts in this first video. In the overview, we discussed the fact that the TOEFL listening session comprises the following passages. Conversations, where students often interact with authority figures. Again, usually professors, but sometimes it could be librarians or other people. and lectures, where a professor discusses an academic topic to a classroom. And you will notice that even in the lecture series, or even with the conversations also can be academic as well. In this video, we look specifically at the conversations passage and the different types of questions we'll see. We learned that it's important to pay attention to the authority figure's stance, because that will often determine the direction of the conversation. So, for example, if the person's helpful, then the conversation may come to a fairly satisfying conclusion where all of the problems of the student or the situation are taken care of. But if the person is maybe upset or irritated, at least at first, we probably will hear things about the authority figure reminding the student of policies before the person may actually help him. So, for example, if the student forgot what time class started or didn't take notes, the professor will probably be irritated, but then probably try to help the student eventually. Now, we also learned that taking notes on the test is not the same as taking dictation, where we copy everything down. That's too difficult to do, and we can often miss important information as well. So the goal is really determining which information is important and which is considered minor. So the key to success, I think, on this part of the test is developing the ability to write down as many details as possible while trying to use only essential language. Again, we don't necessarily need to know everything. So, for example, in this situation, when they mentioned the cost of how much it costs to copy, there will probably not be a question about that. Again, numbers, for example, are things that students often pay attention to, but numbers such as the price of how much it costs to copy may not be so important. So again, this may be something that we don't necessarily have to pay attention to. Now, we will discuss taking notes more in the next video when we start looking at lectures. Finally, we kind of discussed some differences between how important information is conveyed in a reading context compared to a listening one. So, for example, we mentioned how cohesive devices are a little bit different in listening contexts than they are in reading contexts. We also talked about the fact that there are some tricks that are common, but then there will also be listening-related tricks as well. Now, just as we mentioned in the previous series, there are lots of great materials out there to help you continue to prepare for the test. Again, there is the official website from ETS. There's also the ETS guide that they publish from McGraw-Hill called the Official Guide. And then we also have a new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, which you can find at the bottom of the video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 2, Academic Lectures and Taking Notes.